So I'd like to formally welcome you to our Promoting Progress, the Role of the Goal. Now, today's webinar is hosted by the Progress Center, and we're an OSEP-funded center, or Office of Special Education Programs, center that's aimed at promoting progress for students with disabilities. The webinar is intended to provide an introductory overview of measurable annual goals as part of the IEP. And it's designed for educators, leaders, and other team members who are responsible for setting the measurable goals, as well as those who do have experience but are just looking for a little bit more review. Now, as a federal law, all states must ensure that their schools and districts meet the minimum criteria or minimum requirements outlined in IDEA. Now, many states do go above and beyond, and they establish additional requirements for the IEP, and they could add a shorter timeline, or maybe they have additional components. Now, we'll be focusing on the minimum requirements outlined in IDEA, and we really encourage you to check with your State Department to see if there are some additional requirements and procedures that you also must follow. Now, in the chat box, we'll put a link to an interactive map that allows you to click on and find your State Department to look for more information. So I didn't introduce myself earlier, but my name is Tessie Rose Bailey, and I am the director of the Progress Center. Now, the Progress Center provides information, resources, tools, and technical assistance to support local educators in developing and implementing high-quality educational programming. Now, to support educators, we share guidance, we have tools, we have resources, including learning modules and guides, and we base our resources on existing research, state and federal law, as well as local experiences. Now, as part of our year 2 work, which is why Donna's with us today, we have begun partnering with local districts and schools to develop the knowledge and skills and infrastructure necessary to promote progress for students with disabilities. Now, the center was developed in response to the Indruaf Supreme Court decision in 2017. And that case stated that an IEP must be reasonably calculated to enable a child to make progress in light of the child's circumstances. Now, under IDEA, the Individual Education Program, which we will refer to as the IEP in this session, serves as the foundation for promoting progress for students with disabilities. Today's webinar will provide an overview of just one of the IEP components that are required under IDEA, specifically measurable annual goals, sometimes referred to as MAGs, depending on where you're at. The Progress Center webinar is part of a robust series of trainings and resources that we have developed and provide to support local educators in developing a comprehensive, robust IEP that, when implemented by well-qualified educators, will ultimately promote progress for students with disabilities. Now, as I mentioned, the Progress Center is focused on promoting progress, and we focus on it through the development and the implementation of high-quality educational programming. And as I just mentioned, for most students, this really does begin with the IEP. Now, today's webinar does focus primarily on the development of the IEP itself, but we want to ensure that we are also looking at the implementation of that in order for students to access and benefit from FAPE. So please stay tuned for the release of our additional implementation resources at the end of the summer. Now, I'm pleased to welcome today's presenters. Alexandra Marken supports product development and serves as a technical assistance provider for local partnership sites at the Progress Center. We're also pleased to have Dr. Mitch Yell. He is a Fred and Frances Lester Palmetto Chair in the Teacher Education and Professor in Special Education at the University of South Carolina. So Dr. Yell has published 134 journal articles, 6 textbooks, 36 book chapters, and has conducted numerous workshops on various aspects of special education law, classroom management, and progress monitoring. We're also pleased to have Chris Colosimo. He is a certified school psychologist with the Elkhorn Area School District in Wisconsin. And Chris comes to us with more than 20 years of experience working in the field of education, serving in both urban and rural environments in a multitude of roles, including an elementary teacher, a middle and high school special education teacher, an adjunct professor, and more than 14 years as a full-time school psychologist. Now I'm going to pass this over to Alex, and she's going to get us started.
Thank you for those introductions, Tessie. Chris and Mitch will be joining us a little later in this webinar. So now that we have introduced ourselves, we would like to give you a chance to introduce yourself. Please take a moment to respond to the poll question and let us know your current role that has led you to learn more about the development of a high-quality, measurable annual goal. Are you a special educator, a general educator, an administrator? And we know that many of you are joining from a variety of roles, and so if you're not seeing your particular role, you can go ahead and add that to the chat. Okay, so it looks like we have a variety of roles represented here today. About 20% are special educators, 23% are administrators, and then over half of you have other roles in your schools or districts. So we are very excited that you are all here and able to join us today. Our session today is going to focus on explaining the IDEA requirements for measurable annual goals and identifying the 3 essential elements of a measurable annual goal, and reviewing several tips for developing goals that promote progress. This webinar will focus on the role of the measurable annual goal in the IEP and considerations for setting goals, but it will not go into depth on how to set valid and reliable goals. So if you're interested in learning more about that particular topic, there are 2 user guides and webinars provided by the Progress Center and the National Center on Intensive Intervention that we will highlight at the end of this session. IDEA outlines the essential requirements of an IEP, and the first requirement of an IEP is a, quote, statement of the child's present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. Many educators shorten this phrase and simply call it the PLAF statement. The second requirement of an IEP is the statement of measurable annual goals, including both academic and functional goals. The goals must, A, meet the child's needs that result from the child's disability to enable the child to be involved in and make progress in the general education curriculum, and B, meet each of the child's other educational needs that result from the child's disability. This is the legal minimum requirement. However, check with your state's guidance to ensure that you are meeting your state's specific requirements. In this webinar, we will focus on annual goals for kindergarten to transition age students. And did you know that in the 2004 reauthorization, benchmarks or short-term objectives are required only for children with disabilities who take alternative assessments that are aligned to alternative achievement standards? The Progress Center has developed a series of tip sheets that align with the requirements of an IEP according to IDEA. You'll see we have created one specifically around measurable annual goals, including a definition, descriptions of the 3 essential elements of a high-quality annual goal, and resources for where you can learn more about writing annual goals with the ultimate goal of progress for students with disabilities in mind. We recommend that you open the tip sheet using the link in the chat box, and you can follow along as we review some of this content today. So why are measurable annual goals important? The PLAF statement provides the foundation on which the IEP is built. The information in the PLAF is the starting point from which educators can specify appropriate goals, services, supports, and progress monitoring plans. Annual goals should address the individual needs that are described in the PLAF statement. Developing challenging and ambitious measurable annual goals will allow the IEP team to determine whether a student is making educational progress and whether the special education program is providing meaningful educational benefit. Each measurable annual goal should accomplish the following. It should address academic and/or functional individual needs that are outlined in the PLAF statement. It should be guided by grade level content standards and therefore be tied to participation in the general education curriculum. It should include benchmarks or short-term objectives for students who are taking alternative assessments that are aligned to alternative achievement standards. And although not required by IDEA, some states still require short-term objectives in the IEPs of all students who are eligible for special education services. So to learn more about your specific state requirements, visit your State Department of Education website. Annual goals should also help the IEP team determine whether a student is making educational progress and whether the special education program is providing meaningful educational benefit. And it should lead to corresponding educational services. In 2017, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that to quote, meet its substantive obligation under the IDEA, a school must offer an IEP that is reasonably calculated to enable a child to make progress appropriate in light of the child's circumstances. The court overturned the 10th Circuit Court's decision that Andrew, a child with autism, was entitled only to an educational program that was calculated to provide merely more than de minimis educational benefit. Measurable annual goals define what is appropriate progress for an individual student and supports educators in monitoring whether the IEP is resulting in that progress. After all, the essential function of an IEP is to set out a plan for pursuing academic and functional advancement. So what are the three essential elements of a measurable annual goal? Technically sound annual goals should address three things. First, the target behavior is the academic or functional skill to be changed. The level of proficiency and timeline, the condition is the context or environment in which the target behavior is exhibited to be measured. And the level of proficiency and timeline is the level of performance at which the IEP team can determine that a student has achieved the goal and the period within which the student can be expected to meet the level of proficiency. Level of proficiency and timeline are considered one element because they vary in use by the target behavior of the goal. These three essential elements are important for a goal to be considered measurable. Your state may require a different format for writing goals, but these three elements should still be present. And to learn more about your specific state requirements, again, visit your State Department of Education website. In addition, technically sound goals should be written to ensure that the child or student can make progress in light of his or her circumstances. This is the essential function of the IEP and allows the student to make academic and functional advancement. And on the tip sheet, you are going to notice that the three essential elements are listed in a table with its associated icon, as well as a description and associated guiding questions. IEP teams can utilize these questions to design annual goals that will help to close the gap between the student's current skill level and the expected academic and/or functional performance levels. So now we're going to dive into each of these essential elements a little more deeply. The target behavior is the academic or functional skill to be changed. When writing about the target behavior, use active terminology to ensure that the description is measurable, verifiable, and repeatable. The target behavior should not be subjective or an invisible behavior that is open to many interpretations. Some guiding questions that can be helpful to reflect on include, what do we want the student to be able to do? Is the behavior observable and measurable? Is it a functionally relevant replacement behavior? Or is this a measure of student behavior, not adult behavior? And some examples of target behaviors are the student will read 60 words correctly, or student will use a learned strategy to de-escalate, and the student will appropriately ask for help. The condition focuses on the context, materials, or environment in which the target behavior is exhibited and measured. When writing the condition, use clear, specific language to describe the environment under which the target behavior will be performed. And some guiding questions that can be helpful to reflect on here include, under what context will the behavior or skill be expected to occur? And what level of independence is expected to complete the skill or demonstrate the behavior? Some examples of condition statements are, when given 30 first grade sight words, or when given a third grade reading passage, and with no more than 2 reminders needed. The third essential element of a goal is the level of proficiency and timeline. This is the level of performance at which the IEP team can determine that a student has achieved the goal and the period within which the student can be expected to meet the level of proficiency. We include the level of proficiency and timeline as one element because they vary in use by the target behavior of the goal. However, you can also come across level of proficiency and timeline as two separate elements for a total of 4 essential elements instead of 3. The essential elements themselves do not change. And another way to think of this is the criterion for acceptable performance, or how will I know that the student has achieved the goal? When writing the level of proficiency, establish specific, measurable, and realistic, but challenging criteria. And for the timeline, establish a specific and realistic timeline. Some guiding questions that can be helpful to reflect on include, when will mastery of skills be expected to occur? What is the level of accuracy? And how many trials does the student need to demonstrate mastery of the skill? And some examples of the level of performance and timeline include with 95% accuracy, or 3 consecutive probes, and during 8 of 10 peer interactions. This should be based on data and not subjective opinion, like by teacher observation or to be determined. Prior to writing annual goals, the IEP team will have already developed the student's PLAF statement. The PLAF needs to be comprehensive and detailed enough so that the team can set appropriately ambitious goals in light of the child's circumstances and plan appropriate supports, instruction, and services. Academic goals should help students access and benefit from instruction in general education that is aligned to state standards. So let's look at the following academic goal example. The first draft of this goal reads, Jesse will read 65 words per minute. So let's consider which of the elements this goal includes. The condition is currently missing from this goal. It would describe the context under which the skill is expected to occur. The target behavior is present in the goal, and it is Jesse will read 65 words per minute. And then the level of proficiency and timeline is currently missing from the goal, and it would describe the level of accuracy or how many trials the student needs to demonstrate mastery. So based on this feedback, the academic goal has been revised, and it now reads, given a second grade reading probe, Jesse will read 65 words correctly in 1 minute with 95% accuracy on 3 consecutive probes. Again, let's make sure that all of the elements are included in this goal. So the condition has been added, and it's given a second grade reading probe. The target behavior has been clarified. It now is, will read 65 words correctly in 1 minute. And then the level of proficiency and timeline is also included, and it is with 95% accuracy on 3 consecutive probes. Note that in this particular instance, the timeline is referenced rather than the level of proficiency, but this revised example includes all 3 elements. IEPs also require that both academic and functional goals be included. When writing a functional goal, remember that A, functional skills and goals must be considered for all students. B, functional goals should increase access, participation, and/or independence in the general education curriculum or setting. And C, if a student does not presently display the need for a functional goal, the IEP team should still provide a statement in the PLAF explaining the current functional level of the student. So let's look at the following functional goal example. The first draft of the goal reads, during each 40-minute class, Jose will pay attention and be engaged. Let's consider which of the elements this goal includes. So the condition is present in this goal, and it is during each 40-minute class. The target behavior is also present in the goal, but it's currently a little vague and it could be further strengthened. It is will pay attention and be engaged. And then the level of proficiency and timeline is currently missing from the goal. Again, it describes the level of accuracy or how many trials the student needs to demonstrate mastery. So based on this feedback, the functional goal has been revised, and it now reads, during each 40-minute class period, Jose will remain academically engaged at least 70% of the class for 5 consecutive days as monitored by direct behavior ratings. Let's make sure that this revised goal includes all of the elements. So the condition has been clarified, and it is during each 40-minute class period. The target behavior has also been clarified, and it is will remain academically engaged. And then the level of proficiency and timeline has been added, and it is at least 70% of the class for 5 consecutive days as monitored by direct behavior ratings. So this revised example now includes all 3 elements. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chris to describe goal setting in practice.
Thanks, Alex. All right, so I come from the Wisconsin-Illinois border, and so I'm coming from a kind of a broad spectrum of things, and I want to just give some examples of what's happening in some of the school districts that I've been involved with over the last 15 years. I want to say, starting off with these last 15 years, we have a lot of really great research right now on the quality of IEP goals. A lot of it is done by Dr. Yell, so thank you very much for your research and work in this area. But one of the things that I continue to see and that continues to be stressed in our research is that we can continue to do a lot better than what we're currently doing. A lot of the times what I'm seeing with our goals is they're very ambiguous, and these goals can lead to very difficult and even maybe sometimes impossible ways to determine the effectiveness of the services that we're providing for our students. Unfortunately, that can lead to a larger achievement gap because we're not necessarily targeting the needs of our students. So our goals really start to drive our services. Recently, we've been using a lot more curriculum-based measures in our goals, which are great because they're helping to target some of the basic needs that our students have. And we're seeing that those are providing a more high quality and efficient way to be able to monitor instructional practices and be able to make adjustments as needed. However, they're not consistently utilized, and when they are, these do not represent all the needs of our students, unfortunately. Continuing to work on targeting basic skill levels within our present levels is 100% needed. Making sure that they match and they align, and I'm looking forward to Dr. Yell's presentation here as he talks about how to make those align. So right now, one of the things that I have seen in our practices is we might have a student that has basic decoding skill needs or reading fluency needs, but their goal is based off of a reading comprehension need. Well, yes, ultimately that might be the goal, but it's not the current need that the student has. So making sure that we are making our IEPs very individualized is a continued need. I also see teachers struggling to collect data and relying on qualitative data instead of quantitative data at times when we don't have a really good high quality goal that addresses the 3 things that Alex just talked about, making sure that we have that condition, that target and the proficiency in there. When we do have really good high quality goals though, I've seen students make some really great progress. I've seen our teachers being able to align the instructional practices with the students' needs and being able to change the instructional practices for whatever they need. So being able to change the frequency, the intensity of the time, or even targeting what the student needs. It's been extremely useful. Go ahead and jump to the next slide. Sometimes we've been seeing the use of content or curriculum related goals. Unfortunately, what we're seeing on our side is that these can be inadequate. They don't help to remediate or provide the skills that our students need to make progress in special education or even in general education classes. And a lot of times they don't match what is happening in the present levels of academic and functional performance. While sometimes that can be easier to say, okay, here are the content related goals that a student needs, being able to make a solid goal that fits the student's needs, it's not always there, and it can make it extremely difficult for our teachers to track that. But what also happens and has been happening in the school districts is we've been struggling with questions on what do we do with those goals? Do we make them really broad? Do we make them very specific? I've heard questions of, do we name the measures that we're using within the goals? Those questions continually come up. I've seen IEPs written both ways. Sometimes they have the measures written in them and sometimes they don't. The ones that do have the measures written in them and they've come into our districts at different points of time, I've always said, well, that's why we do a review revise. We can always change our IEPs. We can always modify what the student needs. It doesn't mean that that's the exact measure that we need to use when they come in. It just means that's what they were using at the time, and maybe we need to look at that, or maybe we need to revise it a little bit. And that's the same thing with what if a student goes to a different district or state. So we do this to make sure that we are making a very individualized plan for that particular student. With our functional goals, that also often lacks the cohesiveness. We see that those typically fall into three areas: work completion, time on task, and emotional regulation. Goals on work completion and time on task, they do provide a very good quantitative data tool for our teachers, but often provide us with some additional questions. How are we gathering that data on emotional regulation? What exactly in that emotional regulation are we looking for? So we want to make sure that we continue to align. We want to make sure that we continue to align our goals with with what students need. What we have been doing in Elkhorn is we're moving more towards state SEL standards, but we are struggling with how that currently is going to look. And that's something that's on our docket with what we want to see happen. It's something that we are working towards and trying towards, but we're not quite there yet. All right, let's swing up to the next slide here. Most recently at our elementary and at our elementary schools, we moved to from grades-based to standards-based report cards. That's provided us an opportunity to move towards pivoting our IE goals to align them with what's happening in the classrooms. We've seen a combination of curriculum-based norms, both with we've seen a combination of curriculum-based norms and end of the year norms, along with different trials of standards-based needs. Within the last few years at our high school, we have really tried to pivot our goals from the curriculum covered standards to more of a criterion standards based, meaning we are moving away from goals containing content area curriculum that are covered in basics to covering basic skills that our students need, to really try to remediate some of their instruction, to close the gaps, and to help them have progress within those general education classrooms. However, we really do continue to ask ourselves, are the goals that we write adequate and appropriate to determine the effectiveness of our special education services? What else can we do to help our students continue to close the gaps and have access to, or appropriate access to, educational services? That's really where we're currently at. And I would say, I want to back up and say this is more right now in the Elkhorn Area School District, although I've also seen this in the school districts that I was in over in Illinois recently in the last 10 years. This continues to be a cyclical question that we continue to come into and ask ourselves. And as the research continues to grow, we continue to get better with this. And I will say we've made a lot of strides, but we continue to look for additional support and direction in this area. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Yell as he talks about how to maybe close some of those gaps.
Thank you, Chris. So what I'm going to do is kind of review some of the key goal setting considerations and provide some cautions from experiences in various situations, due process hearings and things. And first off, what I'd like to talk about or remind you about, I guess, are the 4 questions answered in the student's IEP. Now, although we do a lot of things in the IEP, essentially we're looking at answering these 4 questions. Number 1, what are the student's unique educational needs that must be considered in developing his or her individualized education program? Now, the Progress Center put on the webinar using the PLA-AFP as a foundation back in April 12th, and that covered that one. Very good, did a very nice job. Second question we have to ask is what goals and objectives will enable the student to achieve meaningful educational benefit, or in the words of Andrew, make progress appropriate in light of his or her circumstances. And that was the subject of the webinar today. Third, what services are we going to provide to the student to address each of his or her educational needs? And that will be services, issues will be addressed in upcoming webinars. And finally, how are we going to monitor the student's progress to determine if the instructional program is effective? In fact, is the child making progress based on his or her circumstances? That will actually be covered in an upcoming webinar put on by the Progress Center, considerations and resources for developing the monitoring plan on June 29th. Next slide, please. So what we've been talking about, what we'll be addressing in this entire time, are the components of the special education process. And of course, the special ed process begins with the assessment, and all of a child's unique needs are addressed in the present levels of academic achievement and functional performance statements. And of course, in the previous webinar, this was covered. Now, what we are covering today is our annual goal projection, or 1 year's projection of where the child will be in 1 year's time. And in future webinars, as I said, we will be covering special education services and also the means that we will use to monitor student progress toward meeting their goals. And as you see in this illustration, we have the assessment, we have the goal projection, but we're also having to measure or collect data on students' performance toward meeting this annual goal on a formative or regular basis. Now, one of the very important things, and both Alex and Chris mentioned this, in the U.S. Department of Education in 1997 stressed this, and that was the relationship between these different components of the IEP. And in Appendix A, back in 1997, officials at OSEP wrote, there should be a direct relationship between the present levels of performance and the other components of the IEP. Thus, if the statement describes a problem with a child's reading level and points to a deficiency in reading skill in the present level statement, that problem should be addressed under both goals and special education and related services provided to the child. That was question 36. And not all needs will be addressed by a goal, but all needs will be addressed by a special education service. The next slide, please. Now, the measurable annual goals essentially tell us what we expect the student to learn or be able to do in 1 year's time. And very importantly, how are we going to know if they have learned or can do it? And so the graphic illustration shows just an example actually from a curriculum-based measurement of our baseline, our goal, and our goal line. We have to be monitoring our students' performance toward meeting this annual goal. So how do we do this? And this has been the subject of this webinar. So on the next slide, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about a book that I had as a undergraduate at the University of Minnesota in education, non-special education. And we were required to buy this little book called Preparing Instructional Objectives. And it was developed by a man named Roger Major, actually in the 1950s. And he was a very interesting fellow. He was an efficiency expert in the Air Force in the late 1950s. And he developed a system called criterion referenced instruction for his work as an efficiency expert. When he got out of the Air Force, he later adapted and refined his method for educators to use in writing goals. His book, in fact, was published in 1960 and became a very popular textbook, which in fact I had used in one of my undergraduate classes, and that book was called Preparing Instructional Objectives. Now, this eventually kind of waned the interest in this, but it represented what I believed at the time, and still do, a very important way to write measurable annual goals. And I would also emphasize that represents a way, not the way, because many states have their own requirements for writing goals. But these three elements, as Alex said, are going to be present in all goals. And those elements, if you look back at slide 17 or the Progress Center tip sheet, are target behavior, which is visible, that we can see, that's measurable. It includes a condition, how we're going to measure, the context by which we're going to measure, how we're going to collect that information, and actually how you'll measure it. Barbara Bateman, back in the early 90s, called this the given, and you'll notice that both Chris and Alex, I believe, used the term given such and such, given a oral reading fluency test, or given a story starter in 3 minutes to write. So that represents how we're going to measure the goal. The third thing that Mager said was absolutely essential was what he called the criterion for acceptable performance. So somewhere in that goal, we have to have all three of these things: the target behavior, the condition, and the criterion for acceptable performance. Now, we at the Progress Center refer to this as the level of proficiency or timeline. It represents when we will know that the child has achieved their goal. And as I said, we're taking constant measures or data collection called formative evaluation to determine if a child is on track to meet their goal, and if they're not, we can make instructional changes. Now, on the next slide, you'll see kind of an annual goal checklist. Important elements that we need to adhere to in writing our goals. Number one, our goals have to be linked to the assessment and the present levels of academic achievement and functional performance statements, including academic and functional areas if needed. So if we think back to the Appendix A in the 1997 regulations, to the idea, it really talks about the importance, and Chris mentioned this, the importance of linking all these elements, these four important elements of the IEP together. In other words, the IEP has to be internally consistent. If there is a need, we have to address it in the service statements or the goals, or both the goals and the service statements. Secondly, are goals specific? Are they clear, and are they measurable? Oftentimes you'll hear people using an old acronym from business called SMART goals. Are your goals SMART? I would add to that, besides specific, measurable, that they need to be ambitious also. You want to have reasonable goals, but they should be ambitious. Third, our goals directed at meeting a need students related to the disability, so he or she may be involved and progress in the general education curriculum. Fourth, does the IEP contain information on how the student's progress will be measured? And as Chris and Alex both said, this really needs to be quantitative data that we can actually use to show progress. Fifth, does the IEP contain information on how progress will be communicated to the student's parents? Because at one time IDEA required, it no longer requires, but many states do, that the progress toward each goal be monitored and reported to students' parents as often as they receive a report card from general education. The next is students' progress toward achieving the goals actually measured. And I know we have probably seen, Chris and Alex have seen goals that are written in measurable ways, but then are not actually measured. Well, that defeats the purpose of the goal. We have to record and maintain data, and we have to provide that information to students' parents. Now, what I'd like to move on to in the next slide is a few cautions I have in writing annual goals, and I'd like to go through these one at a time. In the next slide, we have a caution regarding unambitious goals. So if we kind of remember that SMART acronym specific, measurable, ambitious, but reasonable, and a timeline, we should always err on the side of ambition in writing our goals. We want to make them reasonable, but we want them to be ambitious, because remember, as Andrew said, the IEP is calculated to provide progress, to enable a child to make progress appropriate in light of his or her circumstances. And in fact, the Andrew decision said special ed directors may be called upon by hearing officers to give a cogent and responsive explanation for why you believed, or why they believe the goals were in fact the child was going to make progress toward these goals. Just wanted to show you real quickly a quotation from a case called Carter v. Florence, which eventually went to the Supreme Court. At the original early federal district court level, it actually was a case about the child's free appropriate public education. And the judge found that because the child, Shannon Carter, was provided with goals that would not meet her needs or would not allow her to make progress, the judge wrote that even if the goals had been met, Shannon would continue to fall behind her classmates at an alarming rate. The stated progress of only 4 months in 1 year in reading and math skills ensured the program's inadequacy from its inception. And as Andrew F. said, the essential function of an IEP is to set out a plan for pursuing academic and functional advancement. So we want our goals to be ambitious, we want them to be challenging, but also reasonable. Now, just in the next slide, we see another caution. And that caution is we have to ensure that our goals are measurable. We want to carefully consider the words that we use in our goal and make sure we can actually measure them. And I think a good rule of thumb is if you can't graph goal, it's not measurable. Too many goals include things like teacher observation that really aren't measurable unless there's more specific information added. In the next slide, I just included a quotation from a court, actually a state educational agency decision in which the IEP goals and objectives in the IEP did not contain objective criteria. And as the hearing officers wrote, a goal of increasing reading comprehension skills or improving decoding skills is not a measurable goal. And even if these were clearly stated and open in the statement that a student will improve, does not meet the requirement for a measurable goal. So think of this, think that a measurable goal should pass the stranger test. That is, different evaluators can agree if a goal has been measured. Now, in the next slide, one of the things that I'm sure Chris has seen quite often, and I have, is the misuse of percentages. That annual goals that contain just a percentage is not helpful if the IEP fails to define a starting point and an ending point, or the curriculum or test in which a student will achieve that degree of accuracy. So percentages by themselves are meaningless. They need to be tied to something. They need to be tied to the baseline in the present levels of performance or some other measure. Now, in the next slide, I just wanted to point out that a number of years ago, I was at a conference, a law conference in Omaha, Nebraska, and I was listening to a attorney named Kathleen Mayford, attorney now retired with Reed and Smith, consultant to LRP, exclusively represented school districts. And I heard she said something during her presentation that struck me, and I asked her about it, and she made the following statement, which I asked her if I could quote her on this. She said, when I have a school district with a FAPE case, the first thing I do is go to a teacher and say, give me information on your student's progress. If the teacher doesn't have data, I consider advising the school district to settle. So that just really points out the absolutely critical nature of tying your IEP together, having the present levels as a baseline, writing truly measurable annual goals, and then measuring them, collecting data, and reporting them to students, parents. And I'd also say the upcoming webinar on the monitoring plan is very important. And by the way, this quotation by Kathleen Mayford was 2 years before the Andrew decision, which even makes this more important. So now I'd like to turn it over to, I think, Tessie.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Alex. And I just want to give a special thanks to Mitch. And for those of you who don't know, Mitch is serving as a center advisor. And I also want to give a special thanks to Chris, who is serving in our first Educator in Residence program. And so we're really pleased for you all to share your experiences today. We did receive a couple of questions, and so I wanted to share. One of the questions was around what tools are available to ensure, if you can go back one slide, to ensure that baseline data and goals target align properly. So on the previous slide, you'll see that there are 2 resources, and Mitch mentioned these as well. You'll see them in the chat box. Both of these are guides to selecting an appropriate baseline measure to make sure that it aligns with your goals. So what is realistic or ambitious, appropriately ambitious, as Mitch mentioned. Along with these 2 guides are also supporting webinars or recordings to help you interpret and model what it looks like within the guide itself. There are also practice opportunities for setting baseline and goals for both math and literacy in the academic version, and then for behavior in the behavior one. So I want to just move us to the next part. We have a little bit of time for questions. And one of the questions we received was really around how do you progress monitor goals? And so Mitch, I'm curious if you can just share a little bit about your experience in terms of how do we do this?
Well, you know, that's such an important question. And I think we have so many excellent resources through the National Center on Intensive Instruction and Intervention, and through the Progress Center. But it's very important that when we monitor our goals, that we choose a method that is quantitative, I believe. I mean, I think at some point qualitative is useful, you know, but we need to have check sheets and things like that to emphasize that we're really systematically monitoring the goals. But I would say I always go by this, just kind of remember that I think goals, the data we collect in goals should be numbers and not words. And so the things that you've been pointing out, I think are so important, that we have actual ways to collect data, monitor and measure student progress, and it's reported to parents. And we make changes when the data says a child is not learning or not going to meet their goal.
Thanks. And I want to just bring Chris on, because Chris, you mentioned something around how do we make sure, you know, that the goal is feasible, and we want to make sure that it's not impossible. And there was a question about how do we know if it's feasible, right? I think Mitch talked about it being measurable, but how do we know if it's something we can feasibly monitor?
That's a really great question. So feasibly monitoring it, I think it's going to start with your present levels and looking back to see what is the student able to currently do. And with that, we're able to then find what may be feasible or what is their rate of improvement to be able to make it to that next level. And we need to look in short chunks of time. I know that we look at typically a year in advance, so we can look out and we can say, hey, here is the typical rate of improvement for a student in 1 year's time, and from there we can then make a feasible goal for the student. But it really comes down to making sure that we have good baseline measures, and then from there looking at the rate of improvements for students.
Great, thanks. So, and I want to also say, in terms of that feasibility, I think sometimes as teachers, right, we have our day-to-day work that's happening, and we want to make sure that we have a monitoring approach that we can do within our day-to-day work. If we have to stop everything we're doing, collect some data, then what we're doing is pulling away from instruction. So I'm curious if you have any tips or strategies for how do we make it fit within our day-to-day work based on what you've seen.
Yeah, so to be honest, I think that this is our day-to-day work. This is what we do. So when we are working on trying to close gaps for students, we're utilizing that information, whether it's reading, math, writing, or functional performance, and we're taking those formative assessments the entire time. And that's helping us to drive our instructional decisions. To be honest, I have to say, I think that that's where our skill set lies, and where we in the special education realm need to be at. We need to be with understanding where those goals are, because those goals really drive the services. So if we have really good, solid goals in place that are measurable, that are feasible, like you had mentioned, then we're able to deliver our practices to meet the needs of our students.
Great, and I want to share a comment that was entered into the question box from one of our participants, is that making sure that the goal that you use to establish, or the tool you use to establish baseline, is also what you're using to monitor progress. And in the 2 resources I shared on the previous slide, that's definitely what we would recommend. It makes it very clear, as Mitch mentioned, for example, with the percentages, that we have to understand what it is at the beginning so that we can monitor where we're going towards the end. So thank you for sharing that. We have time for just a couple more questions. And Alex, I know you had something to share about the monitoring of the goals. Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. I'm sorry, Tessie, for the delay. Is there something specific about monitoring the goals?
No, just about our upcoming webinar.
Of course. Yes, so if you have questions about how you go about actually monitoring the goals that you've created, we do have a webinar that's coming up. It's on June 29th at 3 p.m. And so you can go ahead and register for that webinar right now. It's on our website, promotingprogress.org, and you can go to the news and events, and it's right there on a save the date. And I believe that that's going to be added into the chat as well. So you'll be able to register for that, and we would absolutely love to see you all there.
Great. And so, sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot there, but I know it's a great resource that's coming up. We just had one last question, and it's, Alex, you had mentioned something in your example about, in the goal example, about 2 reminders or 2 prompts. And so can you all address, what are some considerations about using prompts in a student's goal? So Mitch, I don't know if you want to start first.
Yeah, well, I think it's very important that if you're going to be using prompts, that it be very explicit what exactly you're doing. My preference is probably not to use prompts as part of the actual goal itself, unless it's necessary, unless you need that, especially, for example, with students who have more severe needs. If you need to put a prompt in the goal, that may be necessary, but you need to be very specific. Generally speaking, a goal should be something the student can do on their own without any added, and sometimes that's not possible, though. And if not, very specific.
Yeah, and I think that's really critical. Instead of just saying, 2 reminders or 2 prompts, I think what you're saying is, whether it's a visual reminder or a verbal reminder, what's the sequencing between those, and being very clear what is the level of proficiency that we expect the student to achieve the target behavior. So I want to thank you all for answering the questions, and let folks know that if we did not get your question answered today, I think we saw everything here, or you have a question that comes up later, you can email us at progresscenter@air.org. I want to share just a little bit more information about what Alex mentioned, is that we do have some upcoming webinars that are coming in June around writing your monitoring plan. And so that webinar will be around promoting progress, consideration for resources, and developing the monitoring plan for IEP goals. And I think this comes back to what Chris was talking about with the feasibility. We want to make sure that that plan can fit within our day-to-day work, that's helping us promote our day-to-day instruction, and is not sort of misaligned with what we're doing. That session is on June 29th. You can find the link in the chat box, and we'll be doing that in the afternoon. If you would like to follow us, I highly recommend on our next slide is to check out our website. You can sign up for our newsletter and learn all about the great resources that we have in upcoming webinars. We do have a learning management system in which we will be adding new resources and modules over time. They do follow along with all of the essential components for developing the IEP. And as Mitch mentioned in his section, we will have a series of modules that will really support the implementation of the IEP. We also recommend that you follow us on Facebook and Twitter at K12 Progress. And you can find the link. And Mitch, right before we go, I do have one last thing. It's that you also mentioned a webinar and information about determining services. Is that something that you were doing, or maybe we missed that?
I had asked Lauren about that, and she said that would be an upcoming webinar, the Progress
Correct.
Center.
Yes, and that will actually occur more in the September-October range. So our upcoming webinar or maybe August, September, October. So stay tuned for that. We will not be doing a webinar in the month of July, because we just think people need a nice break from the IEP. So please make sure that you complete our we'll put that in the chat box, our evaluation for today. We love to hear your feedback. If you have ideas about what we should be promoting in terms of our resources, or you have a question that would be great for our Thought Leader Forum, please submit that on the evaluation plan that you'll see linked in, or the evaluation that's linked in our chat box. Thank you again, Chris, Mitch, and Alex, and we look forward to seeing the rest of you at future webinars.